All right, it's 12 o'clock. Welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University and Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and faculty affiliate with the Iowa Learning Farms program. Really excited for our webinar today. I think really timely topic. We have Patrick Wall with us. Patrick is a beef extension specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. He's going to talk to us today about grazing cattle on covers. I think especially this year, at least if we have a little moisture, our cover crops are going to get a lot of growth here in the next few weeks. And so thinking about grazing on those is really important. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Patrick at the end of his talk. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Well, thank you, Dr. Helmers. Good to be here. And we get this topic a lot and probably more different questions, if you will, this year than maybe ever. And we'll kind of talk about why that is and how this is different. But we'll go through, and I usually like to start most of my presentations with a quote, and this one's pretty fitting. Every complex problem has a simple solution, and it's usually wrong. We're still pretty young in this, I guess, trek of trying to figure out how to make cover crops work for producers. And we still have a lot to learn, but we'll give you kind of where we're at here in southern Iowa. Developing a cows and cover crops plan. This is probably the first thing that I make sure people are aware of. And that's just make sure that the plan is flexible. There's going to be some years when you just flat can't graze. There's going to be some years when you might have to convert over it and make baleage out of it. You have to be able to kind of move and shake, if you will, and kind of play the weather and make sure that you can get something out of the investment you put in when you seeded it. The next thing that goes along with the flexibility is the labor. If you're going to maximize utilization, you've got to have available labor to either move cows, cut the forage, rake it, bale it, that sort of thing, to make sure you can utilize what you planted. You got to play the weather. This is still farming, not only rain, but wind. If you're going to aerial seed, the wind becomes a much bigger issue versus drilling. I had a producer that actually tried to dry harvest and make dry hay out of a cover crop before he wanted to put his corn in April. That plan is just flat not feasible with the weather we get in Iowa. So we've got to be realistic with our expectations of what we're doing. The next thing is you got to have fence, and not just fence, but good fence. Here in southern Iowa and a lot of places, we can't just talk about fence for cattle. You've also got to have it be good enough to make sure that deer don't run through it, so you're starting over. High tensile with flexible posts seems to work pretty good. And then a reliable water source, and not just reliable, but where is it? If it's in the corner of the field you're going to turn out on to graze, you're going to get some cow paths and things of that nature going back to the water. So you got to be aware of some potential compaction issues and spots in the field. And then I get a lot of questions about, well, when will I know if I can turn out? The easiest thing to tell you is just do the pluck test. And all that is take your forefinger and your thumb and pinch a blade of the forage. And if it comes off into your hand, much like it would in a cow's mouth, then it can probably be turned out on. If you're starting to get some root mass as you pluck that stuff out, either the ground's too wet or it's just not old enough and established enough. The last thing you want is once you get that sprouted for a cow to pull it out of the ground. Grazing plans need to be practical. This photo here is a pretty good illustration of a plan that they didn't flex with. Got a lot of water, too many cows in one area. You can see the cows reaching under the fence to get more forage. Obviously, that hot wire is still hot, but we've got to be a little more realistic when weather hits us. Alternative forages can be kind of classified into just basic two groups, and we'll talk about that for the rest of the presentation. But winter annuals, you can plant those in the fall or the spring. They can be a good source to extend the grazing season, either on the front end or the back end, early spring, late fall. Summer annuals, those are things that you plant after frost is over. You can graze 2-3 times a year if it rains. It's a good idea to allow pasture acres to rest and regrow. You can also use this in a sacrifice pad or a winter feeding area. I, for one, like to throw some rye out where the cows were in the winter. Instead of just looking at weeds or dirt, you actually get a really fertile soil because of all the manure. You might as well grow some forage there that the cows will eat when you bring them in to either breed or preg check, one or the other things that you have to do management wise. And, there's a third crop to include in a typical crop rotation. We'll talk more of examples about that, but maybe sacrificing one field for the cows and pulling it out of traditional corn soybean rotation. Here's the categories, and we won't go through all these. But your spring cereals are the ones that obviously don't overwinter. Probably the most popular one would be oats in that category. Spring triticale would have been there well. Ryegrass is by itself. I don't recommend ryegrass as a forage because if you look to the right, it takes a lot of nitrogen per acre to get the production out of that, and it costs you just as much to put it in. So probably winter cereals would be a better option. Cereal rye obviously leads the charge with the others, winter triticale, wheat in there as well. Cereal rye is just tougher than the rest of them, really. It grows in colder soil, starts earlier, grows later, things like that. The brassicas, we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second, but turnips and radishes, for most cow folks or cow producers, those can get pretty expensive, but they are an option, particularly behind corn silage, if that's part of our plan and making cow feed for the winter. The other group would be what you plant after the frost is over, your warm season. Sorghum Sudan grass would be probably the most popular. The millets have some give and take here and there on where they work, soil type, planting date, planting depth, things of that nature. And then teff grass was one that we get a lot of questions about. It is tremendous hay. It's a very fine leaf. It does take a lot more finesse to get established, and we'll find out here why that is when we talk about the research that we've done. So when to plant, this graph here is kind of a good illustration of how different this year is. If you look in the upper left, typically we don't get to graze our winter annuals until the middle of April, and then, hopefully get in there before we go into plant beans or corn, whatever it might be. I was talking to Dr. Helmers. I actually turned my cows out on cereal rye this morning. So we are a good 3 weeks ahead of what you could consider normal for having enough growth to graze off of. So these are guidelines, but they're certainly by no means cut in stone on when we can do some of these things, weather impacts, rain, things like that. Staggering your planting dates to keep your annuals vegetative. Again, another option. You have to have, like I said, available labor to make sure you've got the drill in the ground maybe once a week, and then the weather's got to cooperate as well. So what we did, we took the varieties that are more popular here in Iowa. We did 2 treatments, one with no fertilizer, one with 50 pounds of N. And we'll show you kind of what happened here in the last couple of years. This isn't necessarily by design. We'd hope to have a greater cross section of farms across Iowa to give you this, because the soil types are very different. But most of the cows are in southern Iowa. The research farms that have available forage acres were in southern Iowa. So Armstrong, Neely Kenyon, and McNay were where this stuff was performed. It's kind of hard to view this. You actually have to kind of look at this as if it starts here and ends back at the front. So we planted our cool season annuals in the fall. Obviously, they overwinter, and then we harvest those in May, and then we plant the the warm seasons right in behind those on the same acres. And then we harvest those traditionally, 1 or 2 times, depending on the weather window. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So this is the Armstrong Research Farm. They drilled that stuff in October. It was sampled the following May. And then there is all of the different varieties that we did and the treatments within there. You can see the bare spots in the upper left and right. That's the barley. And we'll talk about that here in a sec. So we tried barley for the sheer fact that it's a big bladed grass that if it does produce, you thought, well, with the leaf area, maybe it's another option outside of wheat and rye. Establishment for us in almost all of the locations was really tough. Whether we drilled it too deep, too shallow, too cold a soil, I don't really know, but it didn't work in southern Iowa. It has worked other places, different planting dates, things of that nature. Probably the main driving force here is the 50 pounds of N was certainly worth the spend. The production increased substantially in almost every case. So yes, 50 pounds of N would be recommended for what we're doing. Forage quality, you'll notice the barley spikes up there on protein. Well, that's because the plant never got mature enough and there wasn't a whole heck of a lot to sample. So you don't really need to look at the barley results, but just comparatively, the rye, wheat, triticale are all very similar in terms of their forage quality and all a shade better than pasture as far as protein, ADF, NDF, and even TDN goes. So really good feed for cows if you have it to offer them. So here's the other side of it. This is the sorghum Sudan and the Japanese millet, pearl millet, the warm season stuff that we planted in behind there. I mentioned we get a lot of questions about teff. Teff needs to be planted a little different than the millets and the sorghum Sudan grass, and it was fairly evident that we might not have done this quite right. That needs planted very shallow and cold-packed. So, it didn't work for us, and maybe it was more establishment than it was the actual plant. And yes, down there at the bottom, based on the advice from the seed company that provided us the seed, they wanted to try some crabgrass. So yes, we planted crabgrass on purpose. Wouldn't ever really recommend that for a cattle producer. We've tried our best to kind of get rid of that stuff. And once it's on a farm, it is really hard to get rid of. And the production, wasn't all that great. Again, forage quality, the teff, you'll notice, isn't any better or worse. The dry matter content you'll see is really high. That's because we only got one sample from it, so it was much more mature. But again, in the warm season, those feeds are very, very good and better than your traditional cool season pasture. So if a cow gets access to that, very, very good feed as far as keeping her content if she's in production as well. Why would you consider cover crops? Well, the first two for most of us, short on hay and short on pasture, are happening right now. So we have to get a little more creative. If you haven't been watching the markets, cattle are worth a lot of money. So if you want to expand your herd or at least hold your numbers, cover crops can be a pretty wise decision to make sure you get enough forage to feed them throughout the year. I'd like to make kind of people think. We look at this forage, if you will, as something that we get 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 weeks out of. We can winter cows on it. But imagine raising cattle if this was the main forage that you had and you were actually on stocks for a lot longer because there was something else with it. I think about this forage plan here and how different it is from traditionally raising cattle that we do in southern Iowa. Cover crops could be a lot of these pieces of this pie. We could stockpiled tall fescue is down here in the right, represented in orange. A lot of times we force our cows to eat that stuff in July and August because that's all we got. If we had a summer annual, maybe we could go out on that and allow the tall fescue to stockpile and take the toxicity out of that grass and go back to it in the wintertime when it's much more favorable to the cow. So just something to think about as we make a forage plan moving forward. Decisions made simpler. If we're going to use it as a grazing forage, it works best in the fall if you're behind silage acres or seed corn. We just get out there so much earlier to get enough more growth. I have tried some early maturity soybeans. We planted a 2.0 soybean in southern Iowa and went out on it in the fall and did really well. So it can work. Oats, maybe turnips in that group as well. If you want something short term before the frost hits. Spring grazing, I really wouldn't stray too far away from cereal rye. There's just not a lot better. If you want a little better forage quality, winter wheat is an option. Make sure when you're looking at the forage seed that you're grabbing cereal rye and not ryegrass, because they are very different. And then from a calving season standpoint, cereal rye, if you're grazing it, is about 90% water. So we try to avoid peak lactation on cover crops just for the sheer fact that that diet is rushing through those cows so fast that you're asking a lot of her to lactate and then either get pregnant or gain weight or both through that season as well. So there's some things you can do to try to avoid that, but you might want to alter your calving date based on your grazing plan if cover crops are included. We've seen, this is a very old slide, but I put it on here for the sheer fact to tell you that, the stage of growth matters. But if you look at protein, it is very rare that protein in a cover crop situation would be short on a cow. The only thing that we would short them on is really, really mature forage on a cow that's in peak lactation, which we know that's kind of a bad idea anyway. From an energy standpoint, TDN, it's really, really good. So it doesn't really matter the stage. We're offering that cow more than she needs at most stages of her productive life. Legumes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. They're just flat too expensive and hard to establish in a grazing plan. We've seen some hairy vetch work. We've seen some clovers work. There's just better options as far as cows are concerned. Turnips, those can work as well. The cows do eat them. They are very, very good feed. They probably work best behind corn silage. They get big enough that there's actually some grazing there. Same way with radishes, a really good vertical tillage tool. I don't recommend cocktail mixes, just keeping it simple for what your cows are after. The mixes just are a little more expensive than maybe is necessary. Can make cows a bit rank. We'll talk about that in a second. Seed size versus a turnip. You get more bang for your buck out of a turnip than a radish, but you do manage them the same. And like I said, when you're grazing brassicas, particularly right at frost time, it does make the cows smell really bad. It does wash through them really fast. Because the feed is too good for most cows, way too much protein, really high water content. So one of the things that we ask you to do is offer some fiber. This picture does tell a bit of a story. You can see that there's a lot of tracks from cows right up next to that fence. They really want access to that hay because they're craving fiber to slow down the cover crop that's there. Just a couple more things: establishment, poor stands, exposure to erosion. If you're using these acres for a profit crop, make sure you're on the same page with FSA, NRCS, and your insurance provider. Consider your neighbors. I'm actually grazing rye on rented ground right now. Management for success may be different. This is not like hay, and your water source needs to be considered first if you're going to graze it. My best advice to those of you that haven't done it yet: start small. Cattle are really expensive right now, so make sure you do it right. Don't graze in mud. Alter your crop rotations to accommodate your cows. Consider risk management. Depending on when you calve, when you have forage available, you might actually have to buy some stockers to get that forage consumed when it's growing really fast. Consider a field of early corn or short season soybeans for fall grazing. Silage is a really great option. And then the only paycheck you'll ever get from cover crops is cattle. The rest of it is certainly hard to get a check from. It does pay you, but not like a paycheck from cattle growth. So with that, I'll take any questions, and Matt can step in here and talk about our next slides.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, we have time, so get your questions in and we'll go over the next couple slides here. I'll do my background. So if you can advance the slide, Patrick. All right. So if you are on and want a certified crop advisor, CEU, please email Alena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. And I'll put that in the chat box. Alena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu. And again, your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number by 5 o'clock today. The next slide, I think, should be if you're willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey.
I'm getting there. Sorry, hang on.
Okay, no worries, no worries.
There you go.
Okay, there we go. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out the voluntary survey, it'd be greatly appreciated. You can scan that QR code. If I talk long enough, people can scan that, or you can go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. If you filled one out for a 2024 webinar, thank you very much. We only need one in a calendar year. So if you've done it, thanks so much. If you're new and are willing to do it, we'd greatly appreciate it. And then I'll put in a plug for the webinar next week. So one more slide. Okay, so we have Dara Wall and Miguel Diaz. Dara was a former faculty member here at Iowa State University, now at Texas A&M University. She's going to talk about motivating conservation action in the upper Midwest, linking attention, communities, and land management decisions. So a little different than our topic for today, but nonetheless important. Okay, we have one question that's come in, and feel free to get any more in that you have. To start with, though, why do you prefer cereal rye over ryegrass for spring grazing?
Okay, good question. Most of the time when I say spring grazing for cattle, it is a fall planted crop that overwinters. We mentioned, cereal rye is extremely tough. It grows in much colder temperatures than a lot of the other forages we have access to. So you're able to get that blanket of forage down in the fall and go turn out on it earlier in the spring. For a lot of us here in Iowa, we'd like to go to grass in southern Iowa by the 20th of April. So if it's a late cold spring, ryegrass isn't going to give us a whole lot versus, cereal rye would certainly be growing much sooner in colder temperatures. So that's why the preference is for cereal rye in the spring.
Okay, yeah. Good one here. With ongoing drought conditions, how does that impact management decisions?
Oh, good question. And the phone's been ringing.
Okay.
I actually have had several people ask if they could plant sorghum Sudan grass now.
Oh, okay.
Because, that's a really drought tolerant crop.
Yeah.
And if we could get it established early, would that be a hay source? You would probably make it baleage. But would that be a forage source we could go to? That's a lot of risk to think that it's not going to frost again. And obviously, if you've looked at the forecast and you planted sorghum Sudan grass last week, you're probably in trouble. So, the management of that, could we get out there earlier? Maybe, but gosh, we've had snow in May before. So your weather can turn on you real quickly. The crops that would, I guess, be most suited for drought conditions would be the summer annuals, the millets, the sorghum Sudan. So Though you're going to have to sacrifice some crop acres in most cases to do that. But we've got $3 feeder cattle. So that's a different scenario than if, feeder cattle were at $1.50. You know, Bred cows are worth twice what they were a few years ago. So the math is different. So your management could be different. Um, you know, this really doesn't matter if it doesn't rain.
Yeah.
I mean, cereal rye, great, but it's really, really good when it gets some water.
Yeah.
So we're going to be in trouble if it doesn't rain, no matter what. The other thing is some of the water sources that we rely on are maybe a pond or a creek by the fields that we want to graze on a cover. If those creeks are dry or those ponds don't have any water in them or the water quality is poor, then our management's pretty one directional. We got to harvest it and take the bale to the cow where there's water. So there's a lot to consider that we don't normally have to think about. So yeah, like I say, stay flexible because you might have to do something very different with your cover crop forage than you planned on when you put it in. But
And
good question.
I'm going to put a plug in for not the next webinar, but the one after that, which I think it's on the calendar that Denise Schwab is going to talk about pasture management following a drought, which I think is a really timely topic. I heard her speak up at Crop Advantage in Cedar Falls. I think it's really important as we think about this spring. Okay, the next one is, are there any cost share needs for producers to make cattle and grazing cover crops more enticing?
Oh, good question. For those that haven't done it before, I think there have been some programs in the past. We've been at this long enough that most of us, this is not our first rodeo with a cover crop. Some of the other cost share programs that might be available out there, the best advice I can give you is get to your county office and ask. There are programs that they don't necessarily promote or let us all know about. But if you get into the office and ask them, hey, what are your options? They might have something that we're not aware of that you could sign up for. But I don't have a great answer for that. I have done a bunch of cost shares in the past. But some of them, if you go in there with a livestock related proposal, some of them are fairly easy to secure. It's county to county variant, and I don't understand why. But one county right next to another one might be very different as to what they're going after. But get to your county office and see what they've got.
I guess in kind of just as a little follow-up to that, do you see any kind of gaps or where there's a need for any program development to facilitate some of this?
If it doesn't rain, they're all going to be asking.
Okay.
We're going to be getting really creative with where to find forages and how to make them grow and what to do. We grow an incredible forage called corn every year. And when it doesn't rain, it becomes a pretty formidable source.
Yeah.
Depending on how far it gets. So we get a lot of questions about, if they zero my crop out, what can I go do to it? Later on in the year, I get questions about soybeans every single year. They went in behind a cover crop and establishment was poor. They're not going to yield. What can I do with them? Yes, you can bale a soybean plant and offer it as forage to a cow. You can put it in baleage. I haven't had some folks try to make dry hay out of it. I wouldn't recommend that. But yes, there are options that we will need to consider. But I'm going to pray that it rains where it's supposed to, and I don't have to think about some of that stuff.
Yeah. All right. Next one is, would your recommendation for cover crop change if you had feeder cattle versus lactating cows?
No, probably not. The limiting factor for most of the cattle producers is time. Okay. So whatever you have time to establish and grow, that's what I'd go with.
Okay.
For most cattle producers, that's cereal rye because it's simple. It goes in their bean drill. You can broadcast it if you need to. It grows in cold temperatures. It doesn't need a lot of seed to soil contact to get established. Is there another forage I would go to based on lactating cows? No. Like I mentioned in the talk, I would alter when I calved before I would alter my forage source.
Okay.
You want production first. Make the cattle fit the production, not the production fit the cattle.
Okay. Here's one that they're trying a three crop rotation. This year they're putting 40 acres of oats to combine this summer. Is millet their best option to graze replacement heifers on in August or September or bale?
That would certainly be a formidable one. Sorghum Sudan would work there as well.
Okay.
Sorghum Sudan might be a little more forgiving if it doesn't rain. It's pretty drought tolerant. If you're going to go with a millet, I would go with the most drought tolerant millet they've got. Forage quality, I think, would definitely be good with millet. You could be fine with either one, I would say.
This individual indicated they were struggling to get a consistent stand from aerial seeding. They're using 70 pounds of cereal rye, 3 pounds of turnips. They're looking like seed placement. It could be seed placement, but any thoughts on ways to get kind of consistent stand of some of those cover crops?
Good question. You know, a few years ago, aerial seeding was really popular, and it was really hard to schedule a pilot. I had cereal rye spread on a day when it was windier than it should have been, and I had really, really good cereal rye on the banks of my creek, and hardly any in the field where I wanted it. So timing is something that when you hire a pilot, you can't really control. I would say you might consider, one of the Hagee high boys, and consider a high boy seeder to go into the standing corn if that's an option. Or if you have the ability to schedule with a pilot, it has got to rain shortly after you put that stuff on the ground. We don't have control over a lot of that stuff, but if you can get water on it, establishment's a lot easier. If you're going to spend the money for the turnips and that, it's probably most beneficial to take it and put it behind silage acres when the corn crop's gone, just from an establishment standpoint. So you have options there. There's really not a good one in aerial seeding because there's just a lot that's out of your control.
Another one, any experience with dwarf pearl millet?
None.
None. Okay. All right.
Yeah. In fact,
Okay.
I didn't even know there was a dwarf
I know
pearl
it's what it says H dwarf pearl millet. I'm like, oh, yeah. So sorry, we're not it stumped me, and I'm kind of glad to know it stumped Patrick there too. So okay.
I'm sure it's just a variety of millet that's managed pretty similar to the rest of them, but yes, no, I'd never heard of it.
Okay. Can you comment on the economics of grazing cover crops? And this kind of indicate possible impacts to corn yields. And, this kind of brought up an interesting point. Sometimes we think about the impact on corn yields and factor that into the profitability, but do we need to be taking into account higher cattle prices so that, that if we have higher cattle prices, there might be, might make the profitability a little better for grazing cover crops?
So the answer to that question depends on who you ask. If you ask a grain farmer, they don't want to deal with idiopathic effect. They don't want to deal with struggling to get rye dead in front of corn. They're a little more forgiving when you go to beans. Mm-hmm. They have more time to get it dead. It's not a competing grass. So that there's a lot more management options in front of going to soybeans. If you have to ask the cattle producer, they want to get as many days on that in front of the corn crop as they can to make it pay without causing any sort of compaction issues. That the answer also depends on who owns the ground, and how much flexibility do you have in the lease if you're leasing it. There's a lot of questions that are hard to answer based on how particular the farmer is that's coming in behind it. You need 2 weeks to get that rye dead before you go in and plant corn. The weather in Iowa doesn't always allow us to do that. If the producer has a train wreck of corn crop after a cover crop because he couldn't get it dead and there was some allelopathic issues, it'll be the last time he ever allows that to happen. So if we're on rented ground, we need to keep that in mind if we want to do this every year. Yes, cattle prices are good, but 3 more days or a week worth of grazing in the spring will not let us rent that ground again or put cows on it again if that guy's corn crop that fall isn't what he hoped it would be. So
I got now I'm taking my prerogative as moderator to ask a couple questions of Patrick. So is there information available? So say I'm a producer that, I'm doing cover crops and I have a neighbor that has cattle and would like to graze it. Is there information out there about, like how much I might be able to get from them for the time they let their cows spend on there for some forage value?
we get the question a lot, and there's
Okay.
no two situations are the same.
Okay.
So is there a blanket document or fact sheet? If we could put one together, we'd have done it a long time ago.
Okay. So there isn't one. It's not just that I'm missing it.
No,
Okay.
some guys just flat rent it per acre.
Okay.
Some folks, if the cattle producer has it their way, they want to rent it per grazing day.
Yeah.
Because if they get more time on it, it's worth more to them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of different ways to do it. I've heard folks that, I'll pay to put the cover crop in, I'll pay to terminate it, and I won't have my cows out there when it gets muddy.
Okay.
That is really enticing to a cattle or to a crop farmer because they get their burn down for free.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So that has value. Again, like I've mentioned in the last question, it's all great and wonderful until we screw it up. And then that agreement won't happen twice. So we've got to be very cognizant of allowing that crop farmer to do what they need to do, regardless of how long our cows are out there. And for a lot of them, it needs to look pretty while they're doing it. We can't cow trail it up.
Yeah.
We can't mud it up. We can't set our hay bales out there and leave piles of hay in there that they can't plant through.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff to consider. If you were going to go on rented ground on what that producer expects you to do and not do.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, kind of making sure that there's lots of communication to understand kind of what the expectations are from both parties in that case. So
Correct.
But I think there's a lot of, we've been doing a few visits with farmers over the last couple of weeks, and I think there could be some opportunities in that space where, maybe it's a crop farmer, doesn't have cattle, but somebody nearby does, and how do we work together to, get those cover crops out there and get some grazing value on there.
Yeah, most all of the situations like that, the limiting factor is fence.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we heard, Patrick. So yeah. Okay, this is what they ask, what about weighing the cattle in and out and set a price per pound of gain? Have you heard any?
No, I haven't heard of that
Okay.
being done. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
So we did some research at McNay a few years ago, and we put developing heifers out on straight rye.
Hmm.
And we supplemented one group and we didn't supplement the other. And what we noticed immediately was the first thing that got eaten completely off was the waterways and the field edges. And the cows that the heifers that were not supplemented actually lost weight.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh, the diet was too wet.
Yeah.
And that's where we learned that we need to be offering fiber. Because the cows that were offering, just basically junk CRP hay, those cattle did gain weight.
Yeah.
So in a stocker situation, paying someone for the growth might be more, related to their management than it would be access to the ground.
Yeah.
So that's a hard way to answer that. Um, would it be feasible? Sure, in a stocker
Yeah.
situation, but weather depending, those cattle might get framier and not gain a whole lot of
Yep.
weight.
Yep. Yeah. And kind of depend. Yeah. Okay. That's I think that's kind of all our questions. So again, Patrick, thank you so much for this. I think it's really important, and it's kind of cool to hear you let your cattle out on the covers this morning. So I think a timely topic. If you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Um, Please tune in next week for Dara Wald and Miguel Diaz talking about motivating conservation action in the upper Midwest. And if you're on today and interested in cattle and pasture, please join us in 2 weeks for Denise Schwab talking about pasture management following the drought. So with that, Patrick, I'll give you the last word if you have any last comments. Otherwise, thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you everybody that's attended today.
No last parting words. Just appreciate what you folks do at Iowa Learning Farms. Good stuff. So
Okay.
happy to be a part of it. Thanks for having me.
Yep. All right.